more compact and self-aware, unquote. The prefigurations of the current upheaval in Iran are, of course, hidden in plain sight. As several commentators have observed, including this morning, many of the intellectual and political seeds now being harvested were planted during the reform period of 1997 to 2005. Today's upheaval, the anthropologist Michael Fisher maintains, has been in the making for over a decade, both via the cat and mouse game between state censorship and the press, and also via the networking of a student generation marked by the violent repression of demonstrations in 1999 and a growing, determined women's movement, partly under the banner of the Million Signatures campaign launched in 2006. But of course, the prefigurative arc extends back much further. Fisher speaks poetically of the long fetch, as he calls it, the waves receding and returning, the long-term respirations of the social revolution. He points to the years 1873, the constitutional revolution of 1905, 1906 to 1911, the period of Mohammad Mossadegh's prime ministership, 1951 until its unfortunate conclusion by means of a coup in 1953, and of course, the revolution of 1978 to 1979. Dabashi sees one of three possible scenarios playing out. Number one, the dismantling of the office of the supreme leader altogether, which Dabashi calls an undemocratic obscenity, but keeping the rest of the Constitution intact. Second scenario, reconvening a constitutional assembly to rewire a whole new constitution and put it to a national vote. Scenario three, discarding the very idea of an Islamic republic altogether and putting the next form of government to a plebiscite. Again, we have no way of knowing whether any of these three scenarios will materialize. For all we know, martial law could be declared tomorrow, shutting the door on the process of building a democratic Iran, at least temporarily. But I see the mere articulations of such scenarios, the very act of thinking big, of imagining alternatives to the existing system, as a promising development. Indeed, I would argue that it's a precondition for moving forward. As many have pointed out, this is a process that Iranians will undertake and work out for themselves. It's not for outsiders to suggest blueprints for Iran. We all know all too well the legacy of foreign intervention in Iranian affairs. This is an Iranian struggle, and whatever resolution emerges from that struggle will be an Iranian one. While foreign intervention should be opposed, however, international solidarity has a role to play, not in some spurious neoconservative form, lacking any semblance of credibility and shot through with bad faith. I'm talking about the work of groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the Committee to Protect Journalists, and the International Campaign for Human Rights in Iran. I'm talking about the solidarity work that international trade unions and labor organizations are doing with their beleaguered counterparts in the Iranian labor movement. The campaign, for example, of the International Transport Workers Federation and the International Trade Union Confederation, the critical solidarity work that those bodies are doing with Mansour Osanlu and the Tehran bus drivers, to take just one example. Also the work of the Campaign for Peace and Democracy, which is based here in New York City, and its tireless efforts to build bridges with democratic forces inside Iran while simultaneously opposing U.S. militarism and imperialism. This kind of solidarity work is vitally important, and Iranian activists strongly welcome and seek it out. Make no mistake, Iranian labor organizers, for instance, have been developing relationships and building bridges with labor activists in North America, Europe, and indeed Latin America. As important as this is, though, it's a largely negative form of solidarity. What do I mean by that? I mean that it revolves around denouncing repression, demanding the release of political prisoners, bringing attention to human rights violations, and otherwise pushing back against the boot on the neck of Iranian activists. It's absolutely vital work, But in my remaining time, I'd like to float just a few suggestions in the spirit of what my friend Fred Halliday calls critical solidarity, meaning we stand with you in your struggle and are prepared to contribute to it as you need us to. But we also offer some food for thought and seek some give and take, some critical dialogue about the movement's future. In a word, what I'd like to suggest to the Green Movement as it stands at this moment of decision, this pivotal juncture, is that it not hold off on thinking big, and that it not postpone the looming economic questions it will inevitably face should it take power, not until later, but rather begin to tackle those questions now, however openly and undogmatically. Mohammed Sahimi, again, has called for the leadership of the Green Movement to prepare for what he calls a transition to a new stage of the struggle, or even for a new government, unquote. I concur. The movement could find itself in that position. Again, there's no way to know if or even when it will. I should say when or even if it will. But it must proceed as if that moment were imminent. Otherwise, it will find itself ill-equipped in such an eventuality. Now, it makes perfect sense that the economic questions have not yet featured prominently in green thinking. For one, political questions simply figure more prominently and immediately in the movement's experience. It was, after all, a political and not an economic event, a disputed election, that propelled the Green Movement into motion. In a word, the struggle is for democracy, not for a particular set of economic arrangements. It's very much an Arendtian movement in that sense. Once democracy is achieved, the thinking goes, once that boot is removed from our neck, we'll have the breathing room and the mechanisms to deal with economic questions. Fair enough. And secondly, economic questions could divide the already diverse spectrum of Iranians marching together under the green banner. The movement's political demands have provided common ground for people with conflicting economic ideas. And given the regime's unrelenting drive to crush the movement, the opposition must occupy common ground in order to hold its ground, by all means. And besides, there's only so much energy. The movement has its hands full, to put it mildly. Just trying to survive in the face of constant state repression, one has to prioritize. Understood. And yet, my sympathy for this conundrum notwithstanding, I want to suggest to Iran's Greens that they take a close look at the case of Eastern Europe. The democratic movements that by and large formed the post-communist governments of the former Warsaw Pact countries faced a similar situation. Different in many respects, to be sure, but similar in the crucial respect that their focus was political in nature and their platform consisted mainly